Hi, everybody. Welcome to the panel, How to Advocate for Transparency Laws, Lessons from the MTA Open Data Act. So my name is Rachael Fauss. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for Reinvent Albany. We are a New York State watchdog group. We advocate for more transparent and accountable government. And a big part of that is open data laws. But I also have a special focus on MTA. And that's how we have this law today, the MTA Open Data Act. So first off, I'd really like to thank Beta NYC, especially Noelle, Kate, Gabby, everybody. I think this was a really excellently organized event, so appreciate you. And thanks also to the panelists, especially our state legislators and Danny. It's a very busy time in Albany. It's budget crunch, so we extra appreciate them spending some time with us today. So I'm going to introduce the panelists very quickly. Senator Ramos represents New York's 13th district in the state Senate, which includes the Queens neighborhoods of Corona, East Elmhurst, Jackson Heights, and parts of Elmhurst, Rego Park, and Forest Hills. So she's close by. She was born at Elmhurst Hospital to undocumented Colombian immigrants, grew up in Astoria, now lives in Jackson Heights with her two sons. She chairs the Senate Committee on Labor. As a member of the State Senate Transportation Committee, Senator Ramos has continued to advocate on behalf of a free, quality, and effective transportation system. Jessica does not have a driver's license. She rides the subway every day. Next, we have Assemblymember Robert Carroll, who was elected to the State Assembly in 2016. He's the chair of the Legislative Commission on Government Administration and a member of the Corporations Committee, which oversees the MTA. A leading transportation and safe streets advocate, Assemblymember Carroll successfully advocated for congestion pricing, passed legislation to take dangerous, yes, big fans in the room. We don't get that kind of cheer everywhere, I'll tell you, but I'm glad we have it today. He passed legislation to take dangerous drivers off the road and passed the MTA Open Data Act, subject of today's discussion, to bring more transparency to the MTA. Assemblymember Carroll was born and raised in the 44th Assembly District in Brooklyn, which is my Assembly District as well. And he's a graduate of SUNY Binghamton and has a JD from New York Law School. Danny Pearlstein is Policy and Communications Director at Riders Alliance. He started advocating for better transit in high school and developed his passion for politics and organizing while working in neighborhood groups and city government. So I thought it was important for us to have a little bit of a history. I will not bore you. This is not really a history lesson, but a sense of where we get our open data laws from and what they're rooted in. So let's go back in time a little bit to 1974. We can trace the transparency movement in New York really back to the Freedom of Information Law, also known as FOIL. And I think it's worth refreshing why this matters and what the legislature intended when it passed this law. So the legislative declaration says that a free society is maintained when government is responsive and responsible to the public. The people's right to know is basic to our society. Access should not be thwarted by shrouding it with the cloak of secrecy. That's my personal favorite line. And today, the issues are a little bit different, but the general principle about openness and transparency, I think it all comes back to that this is the public's data. We own it, we paid for it, we deserve to have access to it. So today, in terms of MTA transparency, I think the timeline's a little different. In 2010, the MTA really started to do more internally to release data to the public. Real-time service data was a big focus that they had to get it out so that when you look at your smartphone, you can know when your train's coming. They started working with developers a bit more. In 2012, New York City passed the open data law. This was really the first of its kind in the nation. Reinvent Albany and Beta NYC were big partners working to push city government to pass that law. 2013, our former governor, who shall not be named, passed, signed an open data executive order. And this was only for New York State agencies appointed by the governor that essentially required a lot of the things of the city law, but for state agencies. And unfortunately, the executive order didn't have the best compliance rates. So there was a lot of attention and interest in the MTA and their data. They're an $18 billion agency. That's their operating budget. So working with the legislature, Assemblymember Carroll, Senator Comrie, we passed the open data law for the MTA. This codified the requirements for the MTA, and I think really helped spur them to get into gear and actually start complying with something that was on the books for a long time but not really followed. And then last year, Senator Ramos and Assemblymember Carroll had a bill that ended up in the state budget, which requires the MTA capital dashboard. This is a tracker for capital projects. It codified that so that now it's required to be published, and it had some new requirements for open data around that. So, the open data law is getting implemented. The Governor Hochul signed it in 2021. The MTA published a catalog of all the data sets they intend to put online last year. There have been pretty regular meetings with advocates, including, myself and Riders Alliance and many others. And the MTA actually participated in Open Data Week this week. Is anyone from MTA in the room? I didn't think they were here today necessarily, but I wanted to at least see if they were coming. But I know that they were active participants in Open Data Week this week, which is encouraging. A lot of the data online on the portal, there's a few things worth highlighting. The catalog of data they're going to publish is actually a data set. This sounds kind of basic, but it's important for transparency and accountability of the open data effort. There's daily ridership numbers online. That's how we know that on Thursday, 3.9 million riders were on the subway. That was a pandemic high, the highest since, I think, March of 2020. And there's a bunch of other data sets that are up there that I think are of high interest, and some new ones on performance that the MTA has added since the law was passed. On the capital dashboard, this is kind of what it looks like, but it's been in place for a long time, but now it's required to be published because of the law that the panelists helped pass. And now in the state budget, the one House bill that just was released, hot off the presses earlier this week, the Senate has a new requirement for more data to be added to the dashboard. So I don't want to take more time. I want to get right to the discussion. So I'm going to transfer over here so we can start talking. All right. So, and I'm also going to open it up for the audience at the end. So we want to have a good discussion with everybody. I don't want to be talking at you the whole time. So, all right. Well, let's start with Senator Ramos. How do you think open data helps support your oversight roles, your oversight role as a legislator? I've been at the hearings you've been at on the MTA budget, and you're very good at asking the MTA what you need. But how do you think that the new law and open data help support your work overseeing the MTA as a legislator?
No, I don't know if this is working. I might just have to use my Queen's voice. Oh, no, there we go. All right. Good morning, everybody. All right. Well, look, I think open data is really important just because we don't always understand where all the money's going, right? We hear that the MTA asks for more money every year, millions and millions, and sometimes even billions and billions of dollars. And it almost seems like, well, if we're not expanding and if we're not improving the frequency of service, where is it all going, right? And so one of the things that I've learned in the past 5 years that I've been in the state Senate is just what a problem contract premiums are on many of the construction projects that take place in the MTA. And there is just very little information available. So we want to know who's getting all of these contracts, so that way we can assess if it really is the best possible company that could be doing this at the lowest possible cost with safety and labor standards, of course, always, right? And that's why, we've been working so closely together with Reinvent Albany and the Riders Alliance and many others to ensure that this information becomes readily available to the public online at, I think, the most granular level possible, which is why this year we're coming back for more. We were able to set some standards in the budget last year, but this year we really want to make sure that every specific detail of the projects is included in open data so that we can play around with it and take a look and see who the players are, see how we're spending our taxpayer dollars, and hopefully creating a much more efficient, reliable, and frequent, and eventually free system.
Thanks so much. So, I'll turn it to Assemblymember Carroll. I think obviously something a little different about the Senate and the Assembly is the Assembly is pretty big. You've got 149 other members of the legislature to try to convince when you want to pass a bill, or at least a majority of them, right? But, do you have a sense of what you think made the MTA open data law successful, given that not every bill makes it through? You and I were just talking about that before. So maybe you can give us a sense of how.
Thank you for the question, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. It's a great question. The Assembly and the legislature can sometimes seem very, very opaque, where you go, how do bills actually move through committee onto the floor? And that process, unfortunately, is a very top-down process. It's a process that leadership, both the chair and the speaker himself, have a lot of power and a lot of control how bills move through committee and then eventually onto the floor. And so when you're a rank and file member, if you're not the chair of the Corporations Committee where all the MTA bills go through in the Assembly, you have to make sure, you have to be able to give a good argument of why we need this. Because so often state and city agencies, when Albany is trying to pass something, go and say, we already do that. Please don't help out. We already do it. Stop. And, we knew they weren't, right? They were ignoring the governor's executive order. There was no way to kind of open the Pandora's box that is the MTA. And I think that finally, as Senator Ramos was saying, so many members from the city and the MTA region were trying to advocate for better service, for more funding. But it's so much easier to advocate for better service and more funding when you're able to actually point to your constituents where those dollars are going. And I think the bill that Senator Ramos and I carry now will make it even better because we'll be able to point to not just how much money is being spent in kind of a general sense. We'll be able to point to, well, this is how much money we're spending on resiliency. This is how much money we're spending on accessibility. These are important things to modernize our system because, as Jessica said, we are not expanding the New York City subway system as much as we should be. But we are doing a lot of work around making sure that folks with disabilities have access to our subway network, that our rail lines, many of which flood regularly, are being made more resilient, especially in the face of climate change. And these are important things, and New Yorkers should know because we do. The MTA is one of the largest organizations on planet Earth. It has 70,000 employees. It has a $19 billion operating budget and a $55 billion capital budget. We should know where this money is going. It's important that we fund the MTA, but it's important that we're able to track how we're funding it. And I know that didn't totally answer your question because I'm a good politician. But sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes facts and persistence win out in the New York State Assembly. And in this instance, it did. In most instances, it doesn't.
Well, thanks. So I want to move to Danny from Riders Alliance. So, how do you think that MTA Open Data really supports specifically Riders Alliance's mission for service improvements? And, how do you think that your voice maybe helped bring this bill forward?
Well, I'll give a couple of examples, but first I want to answer his question, which is, I thought this was a bill that sells itself. I thought everyone likes to beat up on the MTA and extract all sorts of information from it to beat up on it more. But I guess even in the Assembly, that's a tough, it's an uphill climb. But in terms of our work and our mission, and thank you so much for having me here and for being here. We advocate for fast, affordable, reliable, frequent public transit, accessible, and that's tough, right? I mean, we don't always have it easy, and having this data is really critical. And I think in a couple of ways I'll touch on. One, the bus speed data is really, really crucial. We have the slowest buses of any city in America. We also have the most bus riders. And what we have, is several decades of agreement among policymakers that bus riders' time doesn't matter. And that's how we're in the situation that we are. But now we know. I mean, now we know exactly how bad it is. And that helps us advocate for a future that doesn't look like the recent past, for a future where bus speeds are increasing. We've had a number of marquee projects throughout the city, and we're kind of on the verge of moving the needle on speeds overall when we unclog enough of the bottlenecks by prioritizing bus riders, instead of triple parked cars and their drivers, in some of the commercial districts all throughout the city. So that is one. The other one I would give you is about ridership. The ridership figures the MTA has been publishing throughout the pandemic are really important. I'm sure you too, but I can't tell you how many times reporters have asked me, well, is crime keeping people off the subway? We had all these horrific incidents, especially in the first part of 2022. And we actually could see from the ridership data that there were no dips in ridership after each of those sensational crimes occurred. So it may be in the aggregate true, but it's not true situationally. It's not true that specific things are forcing people off, and that's counterintuitive. But it's just to say that, like, the people on the subway and on the bus have somewhere to go, and everybody else maybe doesn't, or can avoid going places. And so that's why ridership, we think, has ticked up very, very gradually, and why we're so keen on making the service better to give people more of a reason to ride and to make the service more competitive with other ways of getting around.
Can I just piggyback on something that Danny said about the ridership data, and it kind of, I think, typifies why open data is so important for policymakers, is the fact that the ridership is slowly but steadily increasing is so important, because there are too many policymakers, unfortunately, who use anecdotal evidence. They may not ride the subway, they may not ride the bus, and therefore they go, well, who does that anymore, right? We had a person in very high-level government in City Hall, be prideful that she hasn't ridden the subway in 40 years. That is shocking. I'm not as good as Jessica. I got a driver's license 3 years ago because my wife and I were going on a road trip, and she insisted I get a driver's license. But after 3 days, she realized I couldn't drive, so she drove the rest of it. And so I take the subway all the time. I know Jessica does. I take the bus all the time. Unfortunately, not all of our colleagues do that. That is right. Most do not. But the fact that we can point to real data, that real people, millions, it is still the largest and most well-used system in the nation, in the Western Hemisphere. That allows us then to advocate for dollars and for access, because there's too much anecdotal information on the cover of the New York Post and elsewhere that suggest if you ride the subway, it's a hellscape and nobody's there. It's just not true. And that's because of open data.
Yeah, and I think my next question was actually about, your constituents. I mean, we obviously know the vast majority of New Yorkers ride the subway. How do you think you can, and I know you may have something else to add, and please absolutely do, how do you think open data can relate to people who are worried about getting, housing, who are worried about education, getting on the subway? How does what is sometimes a kind of big topic, transparency isn't the most appealing thing in the world when you talk about it very much in the abstract, but how do you think it can appeal to your constituents, and how do you think that you can make that connection between data and better government service?
I appreciate the question, and it actually ties very well into something I wanted to say, responding to Danny's comments, is that, people, when people talk about, fearing the subway and not getting on the subway, they don't realize that there are actually millions of New Yorkers who have no choice, right? So whatever is happening on the subway, they are workers. And they have to get to work in order to keep a roof over their heads and be able to feed their family. I represent a district that is 68% Latino, mostly foreign-born overall. We speak 200 languages where I come from. I bet you all know how delicious our food is, and if not, please come around, because it is Queens Restaurant Month, as it is. But the fact of the matter is that I struggle a lot with ethnic media often to talk about these issues at a more sophisticated level, because they just don't necessarily know where to find the information that helps them tell the story about what's actually happening with the MTA. So they'll go off those headlines that they see in the New York Post in plain English, even if we know it's not necessarily coming from reputable sources, or it's being exaggerated, or they've picked a very particular angle in order to paint that black or brown person a certain way, because that's what the New York Post does. Please don't ever buy that newspaper. And so, to me, the transparency of the numbers on the website actually opens up an entire new world, I think, to the way we're going to start talking about, writing about, and discussing the MTA in a way that has never happened before, which is of dire importance to people who are earning minimum wage, who are traveling to, to work at Citi Field or at some big retail company, Macy's, in Manhattan. Those are the folks who keep our city running, right? When we think about all of our civil servants, when we think about, people who clean homes, who are construction workers, most day laborers don't have a car. And that's actually something else I wanted to say, is, I often get asked, well, you just want to ban cars. You hate cars and you want to ban cars. And no, I don't want to ban cars. And I admit that there are some people who, may really need to be driving a car. The vast majority of us do not need to be driving a car. That's just a fact of the matter. Is if you are able-bodied, I feel very privileged in saying that, right? I'm able-bodied, I am able to walk to places, I am able to, figure out with an app how long it's gonna take me to wait for the next bus. Like, I can do that. And guess what? I don't have to worry about parking, I don't have to worry about tickets, I don't have to worry about paying for car insurance, I don't have to worry about paying for the car. I mean, it's just another rent, actually, in New York, and it actually frees up traffic for, I guess, those who really do need to drive. I'm going to share my favorite anecdote. I have a certain constituent who's probably well known on Twitter, so I won't use her name. But, she likes to complain that her son, she lives in East Elmhurst, she needs to get her son to the 74th Street hub every morning in order to go to school, and she doesn't like to let him wait for the bus, so she drives him to the train station. To which I'm like, well, if he's old enough to take the train by himself, why isn't he old enough to wait for the bus? You're the traffic, ma'am. You are the traffic. And at some point, some of us have to come to that realization, because we do need more bus lanes. And we do need to get the cars out of the damn bus lanes. That is just a fact of the matter. And I think there's a serious consumer behavior transition that needs to happen, and that we need to talk about a lot more openly when there are many of us who own cars, and just because we want to be comfortable, but in reality, it's just not the best way to get around.
So, no, that's great. So I'm going to kind of combine some questions into one here. This is budget time in Albany. The state assembly and the state senate, they provided enough money to keep the MTA afloat, but not extra money for 6-minute service that Riders Alliance is pushing and we support. How does open data help ensure that the MTA is funded properly, that we get the money for extra service? And I want to have Assemblymember Carroll start and then Danny tack on as well, because 6-minute service is a big push. How does open data and the push for more transparency fit into funding the MTA?
So, I think one of the amazing things about the MTA, a lot of times politicians and others beat up the MTA, but open data and the law passed last year has helped prove that the MTA is the cheapest per mile mass transit system in North America, and I think in the world. And that is a huge, huge thing. And that's because of how much volume the city actually moves every single day. That you're still, even though we're not at 5.5 or 6 million riders a day, we're at about 4 million on the subways. And I think we're at about 600,000 or 700,000 right now on buses. That because the MTA moves so many people every day, even though the numbers that they continue to ask for, their operating budget again is about $19 billion, it is much, much easier to justify when you actually quantify how large the system is. We're talking 476 subway stations, the most bus lines in North America. That allows us, when we go into rooms, to advocate for more dollars, because it's just not comparable to show what they're spending in D.C. or Boston or San Francisco or Toronto, because the system is just so much larger. And that really has been a real help with open data, because there are way too many people in positions of power who just do not understand the fundamentals of the MTA. And I don't know what folks here do for a living, whether they're open data people, whether they're lawyers, but something that I always like to fall back on when I'm having an argument and not winning is eventually facts are stubborn. And because facts are stubborn, if you persist, you can push forward and get things done. And the facts are stubborn about the MTA. The ridership is enormous. It needs enormous amounts of money. And as Jessica said before, we also care about labor standards, environmental standards. There are other places in the world that are able to do things cheaper than the MTA because they do things that we would never want to actually do right here in New York City. Example of what? Sure. So, let's talk about a couple of them. Environmental review. If we're going to do build a giant building or build a giant subway station across the street, we're going to do a real environmental impact statement that's actually going to engage with community boards, engage with local stakeholders. We also don't give the MTA carte blanche to rip up our streets and to do it with whatever they want. In other cities, they say, you know what? Figure it out with the water board, figure it out with the electric company, figure it out with this. You guys can do whatever you want. You break it, they'll then come around and fix it. And so there's that kind of complexity. And then, fair wages. At the end of the day, we are making sure that the men and women who work for the MTA or the contractors who build out these projects are being paid a fair wage. And I think that's exceptionally important. And I think that is just not seen in a lot of other systems, even in places that you perceive to be progressive bellwethers in places in Europe. And it's just not the fact. And, New York State has some of the most progressive laws on planet Earth. And we don't say it enough. We too often have a national news media that thinks because Texas is completely backward, ergo everywhere in America is completely backward. It is the exact opposite. New York is a leading light for so many things around the planet, and we should really shout it from the rooftop. We should have much more pride in that, and it's very, very unfortunate that we don't take more pride as a real leader for progressive causes, from the environment to labor and everything in between.
I have a question.
There is going to be time for Q&A at the end, for sure. So I want to keep the flow going, but then we will turn it to you very soon, I promise. So I want to get back to Danny and the push for 6-minute service in the budget, because right now we're getting close to hopefully having some more money, and want to get back to that part of the discussion.
Well, I think a lot about how. I think about my trip here today. Where we're 6 or 7 miles from my apartment. It took over an hour for me to get here. I spent 18 minutes waiting. I spent a very long time moving very, very slowly on the A train because they report bus speeds. They don't report train speeds. And the train was slow, arguably because of the interaction between capital spending and our labor protections that can be addressed. But really, if you step back one step and you look at Google Maps, you see it would have taken half the time to drive here as it would have taken as it did to take the train, or less than half the time. And we need more competitive service than that. And so we certainly need to cut the waits. We need to figure out a way to safely fix the subway while running it at an acceptable speed. And to do that, we need to state the problem. And open data is about stating the problem. It's about comparing the speeds of different modes, drilling down within the subway ride, why it was so slow, where it was delayed, what were the pinch points. Part of it was frequency, right? Part of it was construction, and disaggregating those things and taking them, itemizing them, and figuring out where we are. For our part, we're campaigning on more frequent service because we know we have to fix the subway. And so if part of the lines are out, or if there's weekend service outages, we need better service on the adjacent lines to make up for that, to keep riders in transit and to keep transit riders moving at an acceptable pace for folks who have no other option. And we're not there yet.
It's been really hard on the 7, I have to say, with the fixes that are happening, but then you're not able to take it all the way into Manhattan. By the way, on Thursday, I introduced a new bill to amend the Taylor law so that MTA workers are able to go on strike if they need to. So that's a new kind of, I don't want to digress too much, but that's a new bill that's definitely related to all of the work that we've been doing, because it is frustrating, to see the tube and other places in Europe where there are certainly the same or sometimes better labor standards, really high union density, and somehow, they are able to expand and, reassess and readjust and make fixes in a way that we haven't been able to do. And I don't know, how do we compare in terms of open data to those places?
Well, I will say in the US, we are not too bad. At least we have open data laws. But I think there's just a different sense. And, West Coast is often known for having really good open data. They put stuff out much more frequently. LA Metro was doing open data more successfully than New York. But, I think overall, and, contract information, some states and cities actually put their contracts online. We don't. So, I want to just touch on one question before we turn it over to the audience, which is, implementation. So these laws, we pass them. We hope they get implemented. It takes a lot of work and effort. And, I think as I mentioned in my presentation, there's meetings that we are having as advocates with the MTA, legislators. You have oversight hearings of the MTA. How do you make sure that the laws that you pass get implemented? And, specifically, on open data, what are some pieces that you think are important, and what advice do you have to people in the room about how to make sure that the laws that we pass get done? And we can maybe start with you, Jessica.
I think the obvious place to start is know who your legislators are, and certainly, be in contact with them, call their office, hopefully have the bill number available. So for example, I don't know the Assembly bill number, but for our open data bill, it's S3545. If I'm your senator, no need to call me about that. But if your senator is not signed on, that would be of great help, because in my house, my magic number is 32. If I can get 32 co-sponsors, well, then that shows the majority leader that this is definitely something that should be taken much more seriously and should get priority when we're talking about the MTA. And then in terms of oversight, the best possible tool I have available to me, like Rachael said, is budget hearings. And you guys know that nothing makes me more excited than having an MTA hearing. I thoroughly do. I confess I enjoy grilling General Lieber, Pat Foy before him, and asking, some serious questions as to why, things aren't happening as quickly as we would like, right? Well, as to why aren't we getting more elevators and escalators? Why do they keep breaking? Why is it that, it takes so long to fix one? It just doesn't make any sense many of the time. So those are that's really the opportunity that I take advantage of in order to, ask the questions that I have, though I am in constant contact with the MTA, and, and we're able to set up meetings as needed, and they try to be very responsive to me, but of course it's also at the same time been very hard to get some data from them. So during a hearing they'll say, oh, we'll get back to you. I'll circle back with that information. And then the next budget hearing will come around a whole year later and be like, well, so where was the information? And so you can't trust them necessarily to be so forthcoming, and that's why we need to make sure that we're passing these laws that ensure that, well, they have to provide us with the information to hold them accountable.
Assemblymember, do you want to touch on the implementation part?
Sure. I mean, look, the implementation of any law and the enforcement of that law is always difficult, especially when we're talking about somewhat mundane government functions between agencies. There are real legal remedies that folks can take in court when a government actor is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and have it be enforced through a court order, but that is done rarely. And there are many, many laws in the state of New York and executive orders that are ignored by agencies. And it really does take, as Jessica was saying before, it takes passionate advocacy from members of the state legislature, members of the city council, other folks in power who are going to say, you know what, this is how we need to order our house, and we need to do that so that the public has it. And we, of course, have the power of the purse string in the legislature, that we do have the ability to say, you must come to us every year and actually get a yearly budget from us, which is actually very good. Not all states have yearly budgets. Some have 2-year cycles, which make things even more opaque. I think it's very good that New York State has a yearly budget, and so that the MTA cannot hide from us for too long. But it's a forever green problem. I mean, that's the reason why the work of open data, democracy, civil society, right? These are all, in one sense or another, a fiction that we have created. And because it's a fiction that we have created, it takes every single person to keep reinventing that fiction all the time, or we will slip into something that we would rather not see.
And Danny, on the point of implementation, Riders Alliance, you have a lot you would like the MTA to be doing. Obviously, on the service side, how do you think, in having been in some of the meetings with the MTA about their implementation, about the open data law, how do you make sure that they say that they have time to do both? Tell the public how they're doing through open data, but then also do the work that feeds into that.
Well, they need to be able to make the case to keep doing the work. And past performance, is no guarantee of hopefully it'll be better in the future than it was in the past, but still it's something. I mean, I think of something like congestion pricing, where, it passed quite a while ago at this point. The legislators voted on it 4 years ago, and it's still not implemented, and its opponents are still trying to raise questions about whether it will or should ever be implemented. And the fact that the MTA has done 4 years of capital upgrades, built more elevators, upgraded more signals, being able to have something to show for that, and to say, like, look, the work is ongoing, but it will come to a screeching halt without new money, is probably the best argument for the new money and for, biting the bullet and implementing the program that we know, will deliver so many benefits.
All right. Any final thoughts from the panel before we kick it off to the audience? Anything you want to touch on that we haven't? Okay. All right. Let's see what questions we have from the audience. Okay. I saw the hand up in the, yes, you with the tank top.
Okay. Hi, I'm Lucy Block. I work at ANHD. I want to say it's very impressive that you all have been able to get this kind of accountability and transparency from the MTA, being such a massive and complex agency. And I've for a long time been very frustrated about the lack of transparency from the state housing agency, HCR. So one thing I'm wondering is what you all think it would take to get New York State to have the same quality of open data as New York City, given that we have the executive order, but it's not put in place, or whether you think it's, I guess, more politically feasible to do it agency by agency the way that you all have done it. It seems like a lot of work either way.
Do you want to start, Jessica? I have some thoughts, but I want you to start.
It has to be done agency by agency. I think, we have to amend specific portions of the law that are on the books. I think it's something that needs to be done categorically, and we can't just, do it in one fell swoop. Thank you for what you do, by the way. That's an excellent organization that does a lot for renters, and I'm a renter, so thank you for what you do. But yeah, I mean, I think that it does, unfortunately, it takes a bigger conversation than the one we've been having, because we do have all of these separate authorities, right, that are these weird quasi-public private entities that, which, by the way, I'm not just on the Transportation Committee. I am on the Committee for Corporations, Commissions, and Authorities, and this is precisely one of the major issues that we have with authorities and not being a straight up state agency, is that they can hide behind their designation, if you will, to try and obfuscate information to their advantage.
Yeah, we've considered trying to pass a New York State open data law. We have absolutely considered it. And I know there's different bills in the legislature to add new data access as part of the Freedom of Information law. But I think the issue is you need the buy-in of the administration, the governor, and to do it blanket across all of the state agencies, there is the executive order in place, but I will tell you, having talked to the MTA, apparently there is one person in the State Information Technology Services Agency who has to go through all of the MTA's open data to post it up on the portal. One single staff member. So you need a lot of resources at the state level and a buy-in from the administration to do it. So that's why I think the individual agency push is kind of where we're at the moment.
The chief technology officer just resigned.
That too, yeah. Go ahead.
Well, and also I think let's be a little more cynical. The MTA is actually very lucky that it has had generations of passionate outside people pushing to reform it and make it better. There are so many state agencies that are the personal fiefdoms of actors you've never heard of, and they squirrel away money. The state budget, we say, is going to be $220 billion. But will we actually spend $220 billion in the next fiscal year in New York? I think not. I don't think we'll spend anywhere near that number. And so what happens is you put a lot of power into the hands of a very few set people, and because you cannot actually see what is going on, that gives them a tremendous amount of power. And the governor, if she wanted to, could change this. It wouldn't happen overnight, but she could change this if she wanted to. She so far has chosen not to. And she has acted like her predecessors. And so I do think we need to be cynical and say, if you want open data, this is highly possible. And if you don't want open data, it is because you do not want people to see how you are spending money or how you are running organizations, especially very, very old, dusty bureaucracies that have a lot of hidden places to squirrel away resources that you might want to do and that you might want to use for yourself one day. Remember, the MTA one year, and I like this authority, but sent $12 million to the Olympic Regional Development Authority. These kinds of actions happen when you don't have open data.
All right, I think we'll go to the next question in the front row here. And yeah, turn on your mic because then it gets recorded for everybody else. So thank you.
Perfect. I'm curious what sort of coalition you've had in support of this. So both, to what extent have upstate legislators been interested or not? And to what extent has there been bipartisan support or just support across people of different ideologies?
Well, I can tell you that we've had in the Assembly, we've actually had a considerable amount of upstate support because the MTA has done a great job in building so many buses and subway cars in places like Plattsburgh. And so that has given those communities a real vested interest in the MTA doing well. I would say in the Assembly where we get the most pushback is from suburban lawmakers. And it's unbelievable. These people are complete dolts most of the time. We spend more money on buses and commuter rail in Suffolk and Nassau and Westchester and Rockland than we do in the 5 boroughs per capita. We just spent $11 billion building an East Side access station for the people of Suffolk and Nassau mostly. And yet these are the people who consistently want to break the budget back of the MTA. They are unbelievable, and they completely undermine progress when we're talking about the MTA. I'll stop before I say something.
Listen, I fully agree. Actually, this past Thursday, we debated our one House budget on the Senate floor. And State Senator Liz Krueger, in all of her wisdom, actually alluded to the LIRR seceding from the MTA to Senator Martins in his questioning, because they do just completely have this very weird, detached feeling from the rest of us somehow and fight against us in many instances. I mean, I don't worry as much about bipartisan support in my house. I mean, we do have a super majority, although I think in general, without looking at the co-sponsor list, I don't see, I wouldn't expect most Republicans to vote against an open data bill when it comes to the MTA. Largely, even folks who come from Buffalo, from the Niagara area, who have their own, public transportation authority, and CDTA buses in Albany, which are actually prize winning, and I mean, I'm jealous of their bus service actually. They tend to be very supportive of our measures. I haven't actually had to do a crazy amount of persuasion when it comes to my bill in the Senate.
Yeah, I think from the advocacy side, when we were working to pass this bill, the most important thing was to have really great sponsors. We have really great sponsors who get it and understand why transparency complements their efforts to fix the MTA. It takes talking to the chairs of the committees, Senator Comrie and Amy Pollin were the chairs. They were very supportive as well. But the advocates, I think, we had a big group of advocates supporting the MTA Open Data Act. And it was, environmental groups, transportation groups, and a lot of disability groups, in particular because of the push for elevators. Danny, do you want to add on in terms of the sort of advocacy side?
Gianno Lieber always tells us we're the best advocates. I don't know who he's comparing us to, but he says he loves transit advocates and he thinks that we're doing a great job. So I'll take the MTA seal of approval for the MTA Open Data advocacy.
Yeah, well, I think, we had a lot of the open data freedom of information, bills that get passed have a very tiny group of supporters. I will say it. There's the New York News Publishers Association, which, have any of you heard of them? No. Okay. Yes, Tom, my coworker. National Freedom of Information Coalition. There are groups, there are watchdog groups, Common Cause League of Women Voters. I'm sure you've heard of them. There are watchdog groups who work on open data issues. But because this was an MTA focus, the stakeholders around MTA, disability groups, transportation advocates, that's what pushed this.
I will say just one more thing, which is although they're not, officially advocates for the bill, the people who make the most of this are journalists, right? And this is really about getting raw material into the hands of journalists to analyze and compete with one another and scoop each other about who can prove the points about what's going on in transit, and it's been immensely valuable.
Thank you for saying that, because that ties well to my point earlier about ethnic media and the way ethnic media is informing immigrants about what's going on is just sometimes a little out of whack with what's going on in the mainstream media, and it's because they are picking and choosing, the easier headlines to cover, and we can help them get to a place where they are reporting accurately if we can show them the universal language of numbers, right?
All right, I think we have time for one.
I have a question. I'm sorry, I'm over here.
Voice of God, where are you?
Hi there.
Hi, how are you? My name is Siobhan White. I am with Bronx Works. It's a nonprofit organization. And most of my questions come from surrounding the structural changes for the next generation of our children. So even though New York State is highly competitive in that we have the largest MTA riders, not the largest, but in between, how come we're not looking at the structural changes for the next generation? How come we're not rebuilding like China and Hong Kong? How come we're not reinvesting the money into the MTA?
Well, I think, look, we don't work for the MTA, but I'll take a stab at this. I think we are. I mean, I think that one of the reasons why other places are sometimes building out systems, the MTA does have the largest subway network in North America. It is one of the largest subway networks in the world. It is one of the highest riderships. It's one of the only 24-hour systems in the world. It's one of the only one-fare systems in the world. I am a big supporter of the MTA because it is a phenomenal system. It could be made better, but I actually do think the $55 billion capital plan that we need congestion pricing to fund over the next 5 years is going to do a lot to make service better. The on-time performance of the MTA is considerably better than it was, just 6 or 7 years ago, and it's much, much better than it was in the 70s or 80s or early 90s. And so it's not as eye-popping when you do routine maintenance, but routine maintenance is unbelievably expensive. You know, the New York City subway system is significantly larger than the London Tube or the Paris Metro, which sometimes get, you know, people sometimes say, oh, they compare those two systems to New York a lot. And so it costs a lot of money. So I do think we are. I would like us to expand more subway service. And at the southern end of my district, and I think right through the heart of Jessica's district, we have the Triborough RX that we might finally get done.
Because
we're not going to the Bronx.
To the Bronx, unfortunately. And that was going to be my contribution to the conversation, is that because I wrote an op-ed for the Daily News about the interborough. I was very disappointed to see that it was only going to be Brooklyn and Queens. And I love Brooklyn, but I also love the Bronx. I have family in the Bronx that I would like to visit more often, and I don't want to have to go through Manhattan, you know, when I'm much closer, actually. I think that overall, you know, for all the money that we've spent on East Side Access, on the 2nd Avenue subway, honey, we got to go east. Eastern Queens. That's why I love Senator Comrie so much. You know, he doesn't have that much train service in his district, and yet he is such a champion for us. But really, we should be expanding. You're going to hear me talk a lot about this over the next few years. I now have Willets Point being developed. It's going to be a whole new neighborhood just east of Citi Field. And my 7 train is already, you know, heavily burdened. I mean, you feel like a sardine in there all the time. And the fact is we're going to have to think about how that NW go east, because not only is there LaGuardia Airport and East Elmhurst, which is a largely black community that used to be a 3-fare zone that has routinely been left out of any real public transportation expansions, including good bus service. And then we got to go to Willets Point. And then there's the rest of Queens. And I feel like, you know, a lot of the boroughs probably feel this way. Certainly Staten Island does, I know for sure. You know, but that's real. If we're talking about, you know, where our money goes, well, we have to make this palatable for riders so that those who can stop driving will.
That's a good way to end it. Thank you for wrapping it up. Oh, okay. I take it back. I think you, sir, in the middle there.
Thank you. Really simple question. Where do bus rider statistics come from?
Bus rider statistics.
Well,
I think
depends
Danny
what you're. I mean, the two that come to mind, you know, for me are you know, people who drop their coins in or dip or tap their Omni at the front of the bus, and we know that that's not quite everybody, so we know there are more riders than we count. And then bus speed data, which come from GPS trackers on the buses, and I think there's some dispute about some of that data. I think it's the MTA owns the buses, but City DOT gets a lot of that data directly, and it's a conversation between DOT and MTA about where to site bus lanes based on the data about bottlenecks.
Okay, I ask because I know that Omni and the traditional fare system are completely two different systems, and they don't talk to each other. Okay.
And actually, we're going to get more bus enforcement lane data. The ABLE program, this is something Noel's been pushing MTA to do. So bus lane enforcement data is something that's a priority. Yes, exactly, the cameras. So
Champion bus cameras in that one house budget, and better stay in that damn budget.
So that's the enforcement side is a data set of interest for sure.
I think just one point about Omni has the possibility, if done correctly, to give us a treasure trove of data because of the way the technology is built, more so than the old traditional MetroCard, and of course much, much more than a token or using coins. And so that hopefully will allow us to bring more equity into the system, because I think you'll be able to make some really good assumptions about ridership, about income, about need, and I think Omni gives us more opportunity. There are ways to do it now, but I think there are even better ways with Omni, and I'm excited about that.
And my email is up there. Reach me anytime with other questions. I'm sure we didn't get to everybody's, but thanks so much, everybody. Thank you. And thank you to the panel.
Thank you, Reinvent Albany.